Hey everybody, Invisiblekatana here, and today I would like to discuss what remakes are better than the originals. There's of course tons of remakes coming out. Of course, if we went remasters, I almost feel like, well, I definitely shouldn't say that either, because there are definitely some remasters that don't do what they should do. And you'd think it would be simple, but we're talking full-on remakes this time, not remasters. We're just going full-on remakes, and I would love to know your thoughts. So if you guys have any remakes where you're like, hey, for me personally, this beats the original version of the game, I would love to hear it. And if you guys have some remasters, you can throw them in there. I'm not going to do a separate episode for remasters, so if you guys want to throw those in there, you can. If I threw some random ones in, I know that recent, I don't think it's out yet, I don't even know, but the Deus Ex remaster, I remember when that showed up and I was like, it doesn't, there's just stuff that doesn't look right. And that's kind of the, consensus whenever a remaster is a bad one. It's like, you just made it look weird. Like sometimes you can update stuff and change it and it's like, okay, I can see that obviously you got like a PS1 game and you're making it now on the PS4 with a remaster, and you update it and say like, hey, this is basically what the concept art looked like. It's like, okay, I can get behind that, I can respect that. But there are definitely times where it's like, ooh, that's ugly. Why'd you do that? That's just ugly. So bad remasters, there you go. There's some good remasters out there. If you guys have any, like I said, throw them in there. But I wanted to talk remakes because specifically, I was thinking about Resident Evil, surprise, surprise. And of course, where we are with Resident Evil is either you get a new game or you get a remake. That's literally where we are in Resident Evil as far as like development timelines. People are just like, all right, well, what's the next Resident Evil gonna be? What's the next remake gonna be? Like, everyone that's interested is like, hey, is it gonna be Code Veronica, which is my personal, I've been saying this forever, like ever since like the 4 remake came out, I was like, okay, if they're doing the 4 remake before Code Veronica, that means Code Veronica has to be the next one, because it's like, if you're doing like the Wesker timeline, he's in 4 like a tiny bit, then he's in Code Veronica a bunch, and then he's like the main dude in Resident Evil 5. So that's how they should do the remakes, just to do the story. It would probably be like one of the few great things they could do as far as them retconning the story, because for the most part, I don't think they've really been doing that great. That's personal opinion, of course. Story-wise, I'm like, you guys, we can get into that later. But as far as remakes though, Resident Evil, more often than not, because we're going 1, 2, 3, and 4, more often than not, the remakes I think are better than the originals. There's no argument when it comes to Resident Evil 1. Like, you might have a preference, but the Resident Evil 1 remake, I say this all the time, the RE1 remake is the best Resident Evil game. That's my personal opinion. I think it's quintessential. It's literally the first game, which is like the essence of Resident Evil, done to the perfect degree. So, once you do that, it's like, all right, well, that's the best Resident Evil. It's not my favorite, but it's still the best Resident Evil. And then, of course, you have the Resident Evil 2 remake. Same thing, where it's like, okay, there's some stuff here and there where it's like, all right, I can be kind of iffy on it, but I still really love that remake. I said, once again, I'm sure I've said all this stuff a million times because I'm always talking Resident Evil, but Resident Evil 2 comes out, and, I think that was almost at 2019. I don't remember when that happened. Actually, was that 2019? That might have actually been 2019, which is insane. Anyway, RE2 remake comes out, blows everybody away. It's a phenomenal remake, but it definitely has some issues. I definitely have my issues with the RE2 remake, and it's not even just the A and B scenarios not being the way that they are. I've mentioned the costume stuff a couple of times, I'm sure, and it's like, all right, there's some little stuff in there. I don't like the fact that Claire and Leon really don't interact like at all in the remake, outside of the beginning of the game and then like the very end of the game. They have like that one moment where they meet at the RPD, and until after that, you don't talk to the other character until like the very end of the game. And I'm like, what? Like, that was one of the best things about the game, is like, hey, random little updates, even if it's just not a full video, it's just like, hey, here's someone's voice. Like, you like that interactivity, because the whole point is that the stories are happening at the same time. So there are definitely some issues, and that's where I'm at, where I'm like, would I choose the original versus the remake? I'd probably go with the original. For that one, I'd say the original. But I do think the remake is, obviously the remake is a phenomenal game. So it's definitely one of those situations where it's like, I could honestly play either one when it comes to RE2. Like, I'm not overly invested. If I really wanted to be scared, I would definitely go for the remake over the original. I would 100% be more scared playing, the RE2 remake versus the original RE2. Both games can definitely work. You have lickers involved in general. Pretty scary situation. But RE2 Remake is definitely scarier, and that's where it starts to get that little bit of an edge where I'm like, all the problems it has still kind of pale in comparison to the fact that I love playing that game, and it's definitely scarier. And just seeing the RPD redone the way that it is, and it looks amazing and stuff, is like, I might choose the original, but at the same time, I could play the remake, and I got like the deluxe edition. I'll just, I could just slap on the old music. Like, that's really how I was thinking. I was like, like my old music, because I'd say 2 and 3, 3 obviously, they tried to do a little bit more with it, but 2 definitely was like, we'll play like 2 notes and then never play anything ever again. And it fits for the horror once again, but it's like, 2, I think, has the most iconic soundtrack for me personally. It's the one that I remember most of the actual themes where I'm like, okay, I can hear that, and maybe it's just because most people say Resident Evil 2 is their favorite, so that's why I hear that music most often. So maybe that's a big part of it versus, the rest of the franchise where it's like, yeah, you'll hear, probably the #1 song you'll hear from Resident Evil is going to end up being the effing director's cut music from the basement that everybody, messes with and, jokes on. So, deservedly so, of course. But other than that, it's like, you'll hear RE2. And then, of course, you'll hear random save themes here and there. But for the most part, if you hear a save theme, it'll probably be like 1 or 2, maybe 3. And on excessively rare occasion, you might hear 4. And you'll like never hear Code Veronica, which is personally my favorite save theme is Code Veronica. I know I've mentioned that before, but that's my favorite one. But going all the way back to actual RE2, there's a lot that it does as far as the remake that I do think really enhances the gameplay. And of course, it's totally different, obviously, being over the shoulder versus the fixed camera angle. So there's a huge discrepancy there compared to playing the original RE1 versus the RE1 remake. And we'll see what happens if we get a remake, because that's of course been up in the air. And ever since 4 came out, I've always thought like, man, it would be amazing to play Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 like this. And I wish I could say that dream came true, because it did for 2. Despite its issues, I can still say I could play the RE2 remake any day of the week, and it'll still be a phenomenal game. RE3 comes in, and I've talked about this a million times about how it bugs me, all the stuff they took out. It annoys me that they didn't even bother putting like really good unlockables in there, because they were like, hey, here's a couple weapons, and the only costumes we're gonna give you are literally just remade versions of costumes that already exist. Here's the, I'm doing air quotes, but here's the original Resident Evil 3 costume, and here's the original Resident Evil 1 costume, neither of which are the actual costumes in design, which makes no sense to me. But they also were like, hey, we have Resident Evil Resistance as like the online component. Of course, that's its own set of issues. And I know I mentioned this recently, but one of my favorite things is the fact that RE-verse, which came out with Resident Evil 8, has already been shuttered. Like, they shut down the servers. You can still play Resistance. If you want to play it right now, you can get online, you can still play Resistance. You'll lose, unless you've actually been keeping up with the game. You will definitely lose because everybody's like maxed out, whether it's the heroes or the villains. So if you haven't played in a minute, that's kind of the unfortunate hiccup of asymmetrical games. But they did not shut that game down. You can still play Resistance, but RE-verse, they killed that so fast. Just wanted to throw that one out there. But despite everything that happened with, Resistance and everything that's in that game, by the way, they still didn't think, what if we just updated RE3? Like, it wouldn't have saved all the stuff that they took out. It wouldn't have saved the game from being admittedly what it is, which really hurts me personally. And I know, once again, this is one of those things. If you haven't watched my channel, you'll probably hear this if you go backwards. But Resident Evil 3 is my favorite Resident Evil game. And that remake is my least favorite of all the remakes we've had so far. I don't think it could get that bad again. And all I can say is I truly hope I'm right. Because, if it was like its own Resident Evil, it would still be like, it's kind of all right. Of course, it would be a brand new Resident Evil game. It would be super short. And of course, it has a lot of comparisons to the original Resident Evil 3, which everyone was like, 2, once again, a lot of people's favorite game. And then you get to 3 and it's like, okay, it's shorter and stuff like that. But that game has like an excessive amount of replayability outside of the choices, which I think you have like 5 or 6 different areas, if I'm not mistaken, just going off the top of my head. There's like 5 or 6 different areas where you can choose to run or you can choose to fight. If you choose to fight Nemesis, you actually get items. You get gun parts to actually make guns. So you get a brand new handgun, which is the Killer 7 handgun. If you play Resident Evil 4, the purple handgun that they have in that, it's basically the same gun. Like, I always say that, like, that gun, the Killer 7 in Resident Evil 4 is the purple handgun from Resident Evil 3. And then you can also get, and oddly enough, in the remake of Resident Evil 4, they basically have this gun too, but you can unlock like a smaller shotgun in Resident Evil 3, and that's one of my favorite things that you can get, and this is if you fight Nemesis. You get the gun part, so you get gun part A, gun part B, and then shotgun parts A and shotgun part B. And with the shotgun, it's super cool because it's like a short barrel, so almost like, honestly, if you played the remake, and especially if you got the deluxe edition, if you've seen the Skull Shaker shotgun where it has like the Terminator 2 style where you can flick it to reload it, it's that gun. So once again, then we're like, oh, well, we like that, and we'll just take it over. Also, and I mentioned this a long time ago, the mine thrower in Resident Evil 3 is very akin to the new version of the mine thrower in the Resident Evil 4 remake. So a lot of weird stuff where they'll take guns from the other games and then put them back in. Speaking of which, the assault rifle from Resident Evil 3 remake is also an RE4, one of my least favorite things in that game. Only because for some insane reason, because they call it an assault rifle, they're like, we're gonna make it like a sniper rifle. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So I can't stand that. I hate that so much. I was like, this is literally the Resident Evil 3 gun. Which stands out to me because for those of you who may not have played the original Resident Evil 3, one of the big things about that is you had easy mode and then you had hard mode. So if you chose easy mode, you would start the game off with the assault rifle with like 100% ammo. So I consider the assault rifle to be like the gun of Resident Evil 3. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind is like what special weapon is in there. It's not my favorite because that would be the Gatling gun because it's a silver Gatling gun and it looks absolutely amazing, which I found out over a decade later, it actually showed up in RE2. I did not know that. I didn't even know there were even unlockables in RE2 as a kid because, you know, you have to actually be good at the game. I was just playing at my own pace, so all I got was like battle mode. But I found that out like super late. I was like, holy crap, the Gatling gun was actually into. But I love the Gatling gun from RE3. I wish it was an RE3 remake, but once again, it's not, even though it was in RE2. One of the other weird things where it's like they didn't, even as an update, once again, can't change what was fully taken out of the game unless they made brand new content. But weapons and costumes, they could have just thrown that stuff into 3 and it would have been like, okay, you know what? The game unfortunately fails in a lot of realms just because they took out a ridiculous amount of stuff. I mean, honestly, taking out the choices and ruining Nemesis are the 2 worst things you could do because those are the 2 main components of that game as far as I'm concerned. It's the choices and then, you know, Nemesis is in general, just as a character. Having one segment where you face off against Nemesis kind of going, you know, throughout the city and stuff is horrible. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous that they did that. And then the worst part about it is if they'd done that and it was like, okay, he becomes Nemesis Type 2 way earlier than I ever would have expected anyway. But if he became like the old version of Nemesis Type 2 where he was just harder to fight because it became like an official boss battle, it's like, all right, you messed me up with the rocket launcher, the flamethrower didn't work, the Gatling gun doesn't work, and now you messed up my suit. And then his transformation is having like the veins and all that stuff popping out, and then, you know, he has totally different moves, or maybe he uses the tendrils a lot more, which is also another great mechanic that unfortunately you only get for like maybe what, an hour and a half of gameplay as you run through the little city portion. But it's like all that stuff they did would have been amazing in a much more expansive game, or in a much more expansive city even, where it was like, hey, actually connect the city together, like have these elements where, you know, if I need to go to the RPD, let me walk to the RPD. Don't just cut to Carlos. And that was another thing. I honestly, that was one of my biggest gripes. I was like, they already took stuff out and then they changed it to where Carlos went to the RPD instead of Jill. I was super annoyed by that. I'm like, there are so many like cool story elements you can do with that. And they just did nothing. I was like, come on. Like, you just threw Carlos as a random dude in there. I was like, ah. So yet another thing that was very unfortunate. But Resident Evil 3 Remake, you know, it is definitely not in the vein in any way, shape, or form better for me than the original game. That is my favorite Resident Evil. I love everything about RE3. Like, I love the options. I love the costume unlocks. Mercenaries mode, of course, started there. Obviously, it's literally the only game where Mercenaries mode is that version of Mercenaries mode, which would have been cool if they brought that back. That would have been super cool if they're like, hey, we're going to do the original. Well, what could they do? It's so much smaller. I just thought about that. You couldn't have done original Mercenaries mode because there would be nowhere to go. You can't run from the RPD to another location because the RPD is like its own separate thing from cutscenes, and they just put you there, same as the hospital. So you can't really go anywhere outside of like the little circle of the city that you're in. So that genuinely, I've never actually thought about it. I was like, man, it would have been sweet if they did Mercenaries. They couldn't do anything. there would be nowhere for you to run to. There would be no point A to point B, because the whole thing is just a city, unless you went from like whatever the furthest point would be in the city section and you run all the way back to like Jill's apartment or back to the bar or something. That's the best I can think of, because it's so closed off. There wouldn't be anywhere for you to go. There is nothing to traverse where it's like, I got to get from all the way over here to all the way over there. That doesn't exist in the RE3 remake. Like, it's such a small space, it wouldn't even make sense. I never put that together, that it's such a small map. You literally couldn't even do the original version of Mercenaries, because you wouldn't have enough options running from point A to point B. There wouldn't, I mean, you could still throw people in the random locations. Maybe that's what they could have done to hype it up and have more people you have to save, but it still would have been such a short map that I just never thought of that before. It'd be so much shorter than the original Mercenaries mode. But of course, you know, there's been a million things talked about for the RE3 remake, so naturally that was not going to be on the list for remakes that are better than the original game. But of course, that leads to Resident Evil 4. I personally think the remake is better than the original game. I think they did a great job adding more horror elements, and that's all I needed. I was like, the game has great action. It already did from the original game. And then it was like, okay, it has a couple spooky sections. You know, I always recall the maze where the dogs jump out. That's one of the scary parts, fighting the Verdugo. And then when you go into the underground, like the old abandoned prison section, which is where you first run into the bugs, whose names I totally can't remember, even though I have the literal effing jewel. I have an image of the jewel, like just the green eye in my head, and I can't think of what the name of the actual bugs are right now. But those are like the 3 segments of the original game where I'm like, oh, these are like the scary parts. I like these, you know, it's really nice. And then in the remake of 4, you have way more of that. Oh, the regenerators, of course. I forgot about that. So you got like the 4 big segments with the regenerators as well. Technically 5 if you want to count that weird super quick prison section when you like crash the car and then you go into like some prison cell. No, that's in a different area. They look the same, but it's a different spot. But there, I always remember that one spot with like the prison cells, and there's nothing in there except one regenerator, but it's perfectly quiet and it will not attack you until you look at it. And that's how they get you with that one. So that was a good section. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but it's a spot where it's like some random prison cells and you can just look through them for items. And if you happen to go to the side where the regenerator is not at, and you start picking stuff up, it'll walk up behind you and it'll just stand there. Like, they programmed it to not do anything until you turn around, and they made it like an actual jump scare, which is great. I always love that. That's always phenomenal. But Resident Evil 4 Remake, absolutely amazing. It doesn't replace the original. Like, you could play Resident Evil 1 Remake and it's like, yeah, you still have a different experience if you're playing the original Resident Evil 1 for a myriad of reasons, of course. But if I'm gonna tell someone to play it, in general, if someone's not playing Resident Evil, I don't think any of us could easily tell somebody like, play the Resident Evil 1 on PlayStation 1 version. Like, there's so few people that we could even get to do that. And we're talking a game that was remade on GameCube. It's gonna be hard enough to get people to first play that. But when it comes to Resident Evil 1, you play the remake. That's where it's at. Like, you play the remake. Resident Evil 2, you're split down the middle. You can choose either one. The original version is technically better if you're going with kind of, once again, the A and B campaigns, but there is a lot of great stuff in the remake, like including all the extra DLC and stuff like that. So you have all of the unlockables from the original game, plus a bunch of great DLC. So, you know, you can go either way with that. And of course, the different camera angles and stuff, there's a lot to choose there. Resident Evil 3, that is the one time I'd be like, please just try it on PlayStation, or at this point you can do it on PlayStation 5, and you even got the rewind features. If someone needs it to be easier, you got the rewind features now. But I would always go original over remake for Resident Evil 3. And then when 4 comes, I would say remake over the original, but it's not in the same vein as it is with 3. Like, you can still, I would say it's more in the vein of 2, where it's like you can choose which one you want. Of course, they're more similar due to the fact that you know, the shifting camera angles is a huge difference, of course. But I think the story, the story itself is so much better in 4. One of the few times I'm like, that was the only time where I was like, the retcon is 100%, well, I guess the remake of 1 as well, but the retcon, I was like, I'm 100% behind this retcon as being better. Like, I'm not 100% with that on 2, especially with the facility stuff, and especially because they did the same thing in 3 where they made them look the same. I was like, why didn't they do the Dead Factory? Which, I mentioned this to a buddy of mine, RE9 has the perfect opportunity to give us the things they took out of 3. Even if they're the destroyed version, they could give us back like the park they could give us, especially the Dead Factory, they could literally just use one of the factories from, 2 or 3 remake, and then we go back there, obviously decades later, and then that could be the Dead Factory since we didn't get that in 3. Wanted to throw that out there to you guys. I don't know if they'll do that, but I was like, man, they have a chance to give us the things they took from us, even though it won't be the same, of course, because we're not gonna, well, I mean, heck, they took it out the remake. They could just throw the Gravedigger in, why not? But if they wanted to do that and make up for the mistakes they made with the RE3 remake, they could 100% do it in RE9. I doubt it's gonna happen, but I just want to randomly throw that out there because I would lose my mind. And they're like, yep, we know we effed up with 3. Here's the Dead Factory now. Here's the park. I was gonna say here's the hospital, but we got a remake version of the hospital, which was cool. It was a much bigger section than in the original game. I did like that part. The shooting part where the zombies like disappear because it would take up too much space if they left the bodies, that was weird. But anyway, we're talking RE4. I personally like the remake of 4 way more than I like the original. Love the original. I beat that game 13 times. I'm pretty sure it's the one I beat the most, like a lot of people, admittedly. You play through a bunch of the original ones back in the day, and you get a little bit here and there when it comes to New Game Plus, especially once you unlock the weapons, that's where it really comes into play. But then you get 4 and it's like, all right, well, I'm straight up upgrading weapons now. It's not just, well, I got the weapon and then I unlocked the infinite ammo version. It's like, no, you got like 5 handguns, which as a kid, I did not understand the fact that all the handguns did different stuff. I didn't realize that. I thought it was, you find a new handgun, that's the better handgun. You find a new shotgun, that's the better shotgun. I thought that's how that went. I didn't realize that there were so many different elements of like, well, this handgun does this shotgun does this, it's better for spread, or this is better up close. A million different things. But I will say this, I'm 100% Punisher. I don't remember what I did back in the day in OG4, but I'm 100% a Punisher guy. Like the fact that you can shoot through characters, and then especially when you get the upgrade, you can shoot through 5 people, that is a godsend. In the castle specifically, because you can shoot through the wooden shields because it counts as a person, and you can still hit the person in the head. Absolutely amazing. Like, I love that. And the Striker's my #1 shotgun. I don't care. Still pissed, once again, with the remake. I am pissed that they took the 100-round drum away from us. I don't know why they would do that. That was one of the best things about it, is just having 100 rounds and just going crazy and just letting the thing fly. So I do hate that. And the fact that they didn't give us the PRL 412 laser cannon. That was just mean. That was very disrespectful that they did not put that in there. That's ridiculous. I also wish we got to see Ada's Separate Ways costume, or not Separate Ways, her Assignment Ada costume. I love that combat uniform for her. It might actually be my favorite Ada costume. So that's that. But I do love 4 more than I love the original. And even though I haven't played through it 13 effing times, it also has a slight leg up, although at this point you can also play the original this way now because of technology. But I was gonna say VR. Technically you can do that with the original RE4 as well. And the original RE4 has a leg up on the remake because for some insane effing reason, you cannot play Mercenaries mode in VR on the remake. I don't understand that in literally any way, shape, or form, because I'm like, it's the exact same thing. You're just playing the game. The only difference is having like the 2 buttons, every character has like their little specialty thing. But I'm like, it's exactly the same. When you do kicks, the camera changes and stuff, so I'm like, well, that's, it's not that crazy. Just make that happen for every character. But for some inexplicable reason, they didn't do that. So that's very unfortunate. That's the one I'm like, man, Separate Ways doesn't have a VR mode, and neither does Mercenaries. And that's really unfortunate. I really wish it did. But still like the 4 remake more than I like the original, even though I still love the original. Like I said, probably the Resident Evil I've beaten the most times, like 13 times, if not more. So love RE4 remake. I like that one more. Like I said, for me, it's 1 and 4 are definitive. 3 obviously not, but since I'm going Resident Evil and literally 4 of the effing games have remakes, we're just going through 1 through 4. But 1 and 4 guaranteed. 2 is like that weird split down the middle. But I'd probably choose the remake because if I'm going all content, the back and forth story elements are annoying to have missing. But there's still enough of a change because you still have the stuff with, like, if you do Claire and Sherry, it's still very different. Like, you literally have a section where you play as Sherry, you have the section where you play as Ada. I feel like there's enough, even though there's the discrepancies of like the same boss battles, and I hate that. There's still enough of it where I'm like, all right, I still get like the main differences, plus you get all the DLC. I'd probably ultimately end up picking the 2 remake over the original version of 2, just because there would be so much more actual content to play. Because even with the differences in the campaigns, even in the original game, it's like, you still kind of go through a lot of the same stuff, realistically. So I'd probably still choose the remake personally. Obviously 3, like I said, I wouldn't. 4, I definitely would. And I'm almost home, so this is basically the end of the video. But so that this isn't 100% about Resident Evil, I did have one game where I was like, this is the one I want to talk about outside of Resident Evil, because it's like, yeah, this is better than the original. Have to start off by saying this. Fuck EA, because I hate them, because they killed Dead Space twice. I know I say that a lot, but I hate them for it. Dead Space Remake is a beautiful game. It is a perfect game. In fact, it would be perfect if it had a photo mode. It is one of the greatest pains that that game does not have a photo mode. But the Dead Space Remake is just like the RE1 remake. You don't have to tell somebody like, oh, you should play both of them. I think you should. I mean, I'm just a nerd, so I'm always be like, hey, if you're playing Resident Evil Remake, you should play the original just to experience it. If you're playing Dead Space, you should play the original just to experience it. Because once again, much like, the remake of 1 or the remake of 2 or 3 or 4, Dead Space Remake also changes up elements of the story. It changes how characters die, it changes how they interact with each other, it changes just locations and things like that. It adds stuff from the second game, so you see things from a new perspective. Phenomenal work. I hate EA once again, because like the people that developed that game were clearly fans of Dead Space like I was, where I'm like, oh, they put this in for, like they did so much stuff that was amazing. But the Dead Space Remake is 100% one of those things, like just like RE1, where you could straight up replace it. Even with the additions to the story, you could straight up replace the original and be like, this is what it is. There's enough differences to where you could play both games and be like, oh, that's definitely different from the original version. But it's not like 4. Like 4 feels like 2 totally separate games. 3 is totally separate games. 2 feels like totally separate games. Obviously, I'm talking Resident Evil. And then RE1 is where it's like, there's some changes here. Even some of the, structurally, there's changes in the mansion. Same thing for the Ishimura. There's some changes here for sure. But for the most part, these games are like almost identical. You do the same stuff. They add like a little bit here, or they'll even add a little extra flair to something that happened. Because them doing a secondary twist, I could not believe. I was like, I can't believe they made a new twist for a game that where I was like, yeah, I know what's gonna happen. And they made a new twist for it. Absolutely beautiful. Couldn't believe that they did that. So fantastic job with that. Had to throw in the Dead Space remake because of course I'm a huge Dead Space fan. And man, it kills me we're not gonna get a Dead Space 2 remake. Like the amount of things that happened in that game that I would have loved to have seen remade, ridiculous. But EA is gonna screw up the way that they do, at least, for fans. They'll make all their money off of sports and stuff. But had to throw Dead Space in there because it needs the recognition, and once again, with it being killed off, it's just kind of like, we got to just bring it up when we can, because that's the only time you'll hear about it. So unless another miracle happens, because it was a miracle we got the remake in the first place. So unless another miracle happens, just got to throw out support for Dead Space, because it's one of my favorite franchises. And that remake 100% is on the same level as the RE1 remake, where it's like, you could just straight up leave the original behind 100%, and you basically have the same game updated, and it's okay. Like I said, 2 has enough differences, I think. 3, once again, is like a total, 3 and 4 are like totally different games. 4 does it in a great way, and 3 does it in a bad way, where I'm like, I actually like the original more. Like, there is no back and forth for me. I know people like the remake of RE3, and I'm glad some people do. I just don't like it as much because of everything that's taken out. I can play that game and enjoy it, but all I think about is 3 is literally my favorite. I'll be more critical of that than I would literally any other Resident Evil remake that comes out, except maybe Code Veronica. Code Veronica has a special place in my heart too. Even though I didn't like replay it as much, something about that being like, for me, that was my PS2 Resident Evil until I eventually got 4. But for a long time, I shouldn't say for a long time it was on GameCube, but for a long time, it was the only one on PlayStation before RE4 eventually existed in general. So it was like, it was a special place where like I only had that as my Resident Evil game for a long time, because I wasn't playing any of my PS1 Resident Evil games on my PS2. So I only had Code Veronica for a long time until 4 came out. So I really like Code Veronica a lot. Plus I love Claire. She's probably like my second favorite character in the franchise. So like, I'm a huge Claire person. She needs more respect, by the way. But anyway, wanted to do that, and I think that's a good stopping point. Like, I'm just sitting in the parking spot at my house right now. But anyway, would love to know your thoughts on what remakes are better than the original games. There's a ton out there, of course, so I would love to hear yours. Obviously, I'm just stuck on, wanting to talk about Resident Evil, so that's just me. But if you guys have any that I didn't mention, of course, anything outside of Resident Evil and Dead Space, Definitely comment below. I would love to hear what remakes you guys had. Like I said in the beginning, if you guys want to throw remasters in there where it's like, why the F did they do that? Remasters that just totally failed. I would love to hear that as well, just to talk to you guys about it. I don't have a lot of remasters that I've really bought, so I don't really have a ton to say when it comes to that. Like the only remaster I can think of is I got the Metal Gear games when it was like the HD collection. So I got those, and I got the Uncharted remaster because I got the trilogy for that, and then I have Shadow of the Colossus. Now, if you ask me to compare, I can't because I bought those games and didn't play any of them. But that's neither here nor there. We're talking about games I have played and games you've played. So please put your comments down in the comment section below. Do not judge me. And of course, thanks for watching.